So hi there and welcome to another edition of the Garden Laboratory. And as you know, I turned my garden into a laboratory. I've been sharing videos about how I've been getting on since March, and I'm going to share in this video what I learned from the Garden Laboratory. Now the plan was simple. You plan, you act, and then you reflect. Plan, act, reflect. You observe what happens and then you learn from that. So in this video, I'm going to summarize everything that I've learned from the experiment of the Garden Laboratory. So over the course of the season, I planted vegetables, I experimented with different growing methods, I introduced hens, I managed my bees, and I documented the results through the videos that I've shared with you online. Now, I did promise to provide an update at the end of July, and we're now in early August, and the growing season is not completely over, but I still feel I've learned enough to bring the main experiment to a close for this year. So I may make another short update in the autumn because I do intend to plant some additional seeds. For example, I've run out of lettuce, I've run out of kales, so I'm going to have to replant those and possibly maybe show you maybe other bits and pieces, for example harvesting potatoes, etc. Maybe give you an update on the bees in the autumn and the hens, but the main experiment is ending with this video. So an experiment doesn't need to continue simply because you originally planned it to last longer. So I had this idea maybe it would go on till the autumn, but I think I've reached a point where I've gathered enough information to make the better decisions, so I don't need to continue with that, and I've learned the main lessons. And as I said before, the purpose of this experiment wasn't to create a perfect garden. It certainly isn't a perfect garden. It's really to learn, and that's what it's all about, learning. And also a key thing is to discover what the right garden is for me, because we're all different, we're all in individual circumstances. There's no one size fits all plan when it comes to gardening. I think that's something really important. So in this video, I'm going to share the lessons I've learned over the last number of months in the Garden Laboratory. So let's start then with the lessons. Well, lesson 1, make the most of your spring energy. Well, in spring, I had tremendous energy and enthusiasm, and I think I start off every year in the garden the same way. And I wanted to clear ground, I wanted to prepare beds, I wanted to clean out the polytunnels, sow seeds, and try as many different ideas as possible. And you can check back in the videos, and you'll see me busy there clearing the polytunnels. So at that stage, the garden felt exciting, it felt full of possibility. But as the season progressed, it became much harder because the weeds appeared, the grass needed to be cut, the hedges needed attention, the weather itself became hotter, and other activities began competing for my time and energy. So my first lesson is to make the most of that early spring enthusiasm. So get as much of the important groundwork completed as possible while the energy is there. But there's also another side to that lesson. Do not create more garden in the spring than you will be able to maintain in the summer. Now, the garden should not be designed around your springtime enthusiasm. It should be designed around your midsummer capacity. Lesson number 2. The hens were a major success. So the hens were probably one of the most successful parts of the Garden Laboratory. They have helped clear the area beneath the apple trees and kept many of the weeds down. They're also giving us 3 or 4 eggs every day, which is brilliant. So once the initial setup then was complete, they've been relatively easy to manage and have not required a great deal of labour. There's also something very enjoyable about simply having them around. They bring life and movement into the garden. And the hens provide food, they help manage the ground and make the garden a more pleasant place to be. They did not just produce eggs, they became part of the garden. So lesson number 3. Tomatoes are easy once established, but train them early. So again, the tomatoes were another success, but the hardest part is in the spring, clearing the polytunnels, preparing the ground, sowing the seeds and getting the plants established. And I remember when I planted the seeds, you have waited about 2 or 3 weeks, and then you have these little seed leaves coming up. They look so delicate, but once they get going, they really take off. So getting them established is the challenge. So once they were growing, then they were relatively easy to maintain, and most of the regular work involved watering. However, I did learn an important lesson about training tomato plants. I should have encouraged them to grow upwards along the strings and pinched out many of the side shoots. So instead, many of the plants became extremely bushy and began crawling along the ground. Now, that made them harder to manage, and some of the tomatoes formed close to ground level where birds and rodents could reach them easily. So next year, I'm going to pay much more attention to training the plants from an early stage. A small amount of work at the right time can prevent a much larger problem later. Lesson number 4. Raised beds worked extremely well. Now, the raised beds were ideal for growing lettuce and other leafy vegetables. They were easier to manage than the larger open growing areas, particularly when it came to keeping weeds under control. They also produced vegetables which came directly into the house and were regularly used. Now, the lettuce was especially useful for salads. We have now run out of lettuce and kale, which tells me that these were among the most valuable crops in the garden. Now, next year, I would like to create more raised beds and use them mainly for vegetables we regularly harvest and eat. A small, manageable bed producing something useful can be more valuable than a much larger area that becomes difficult to maintain. Lesson number 5. Grow what you actually eat. This year I planted many different seeds, partly out of curiosity, which is fine. I tried watermelons, I tried peppers and several other crops because I wanted to see whether they would grow. Now, there's nothing wrong, as I said, with experimenting, and this is part of the garden laboratory idea, experimenting. But some of these crops provided limited practical value to us. They weren't necessarily foods we regularly needed to eat, but they still required space, they still required watering, they still required time and attention. And at the same time, then we ran out of lettuce and kale, the actual vegetables we use. So next year then, I need to begin with a simple question. What do we regularly eat? Now, most of the garden should then be devoted to producing those foods. There's little value in growing interesting crops if you run out of the everyday vegetables you use each week. Now, of course, curiosity encourages experimentation, but limited time and energy also requires focus. So just because I can grow something doesn't necessarily mean it is worth growing. Lesson number 6, succession planting matters. So running out of lettuce and kale taught me another lesson. It's not enough to choose the right vegetables. I also need to plan when they will be available. If everything is planted at once, they may all mature at once, and then everything is gone. So next year, I need to sow smaller amounts of lettuce, kale, and other useful vegetables at intervals throughout the season. So that should provide a more continuous supply. The goal is not simply to produce a large quantity of food at one point in time. The goal is to have the vegetables we need when we need them. Lesson number 7. My no-dig garden failed. Okay, the no-dig garden section of the garden, it wasn't successful. I covered the ground with cardboard. I planted into it, hoping the cardboard would suppress the weeds. However, the weeds eventually grew through, and you can see there's a particular weed there which is a real nuisance, and it's called horse's tails, and that really pushed up through the cardboard. The problem was not simply the method though. I was also not prepared to weed the area regularly enough while the weeds were still small and manageable. So once I fell behind, the area then quickly became overwhelmed, it became overgrown, and it has now largely reverted back to weeds and briars, as you can see. So the lesson is that a no dig does not mean no maintenance. Whatever method you use, weeds need to be dealt with early. So when a weed is small, it can take only a few seconds to remove, but once the area becomes overgrown, recovering it becomes a major task. Of course, next year then, I'm going to either maintain a new growing area properly from the beginning or cultivate a much smaller area. So there's little point in creating more garden than I can realistically have the capacity to manage. Lesson 8. The strawberries were not worth the effort. The strawberries grew, they flowered and produced fruit. The problem was that birds and probably rodents ate most of the fruit before I could harvest it. Now the plants themselves were successful. Protecting the crop was the problem. Strawberries are very attractive to wildlife. Protecting them properly would require netting, barriers and regular checking. Now for me, the care and attention required were greater than the value of the crop. So I therefore do not plan to grow strawberries again next year. Now this was a useful experiment, and sometimes the most valuable result is deciding what not to repeat. The strawberries grew successfully, but they were not successful for me. Lesson 9. The no-dig potatoes were disappointing. Now, I also experimented with growing potatoes on cardboard and covering them with grass clippings. They didn't perform particularly well. However, I cannot blame the method entirely because we experienced very dry conditions this year in Ireland and indeed in Europe, and the drought may have also affected the plants and reduced the final yield. So even allowing for that, the experiment did not persuade me to continue with the method. So next time I would return to planting potatoes directly and properly into the prepared soil. Again, experimentation is really useful, but sometimes the established method is established for a reason. Now for potatoes, I think it is difficult to beat planting them directly into the soil. Lesson 10. The bees achieved exactly what I wanted. Now the bees were a major success this year. I harvested approximately 90 kilos of honey, with about 70 kilos coming from only one hive. Now that is more than enough for our household needs and for gifts to family and friends. So that was my objective. So the experiment succeeded. However, it was a sunny and warm summer, which undoubtedly helped the bees and contributed to the harvest. Again, for me, beekeeping is not simply about producing honey. It's about also looking at what is a reasonable investment of time, effort and money. I don't want the bees to become another demanding activity requiring constant attention and expense. My approach is to keep things relatively simple, minimize unnecessary inputs, including my time, and allow the bees to do most of the work. The goal was not to maximize honey. The goal was enough honey with minimal unnecessary input. So this year I achieved that. And I have been keeping bees and teaching beekeeping for many years. And I also have online beekeeping courses for anyone who would like to explore the subject further. Now I will leave the details below. But the principle I'm following here is simple. Produce enough for our needs without making beekeeping unnecessarily complicated or expensive. And if you go and do a standard beekeeping course, you will be told you have to spend a lot of money and you have to invest a lot of time. My approach is the opposite. Spend little money, as little as possible, and with minimal time input. But you can still get a very good yield to meet your needs. Lesson 11. Define success according to your own objective. Now the bees illustrate a broader lesson. Success is not always to be measured by maximum production, perfect appearance, or what someone else says should be achieved. Each part of the garden needs to be judged against the reason I introduced it. The hens succeeded because they provide eggs, they help manage the ground and are enjoyable to have around. The raised beds succeeded because they produce vegetables we actually used. The strawberries failed for me because the protection required was greater than the value of the fruit. The no-dig garden failed because it required more maintenance than I was prepared to give it. So success depends on the objective. It is not simply about asking whether something worked in theory. It's about asking whether it worked for me. Lesson 12. Failure is still useful information. So some parts of this experiment failed, but that does not mean the experiment itself failed. The purpose of the experiment is not to prove that every idea is correct. The purpose is to discover what happens. The strawberries, the no-dig area and the potatoes all produced useful information. They help me decide what I will not repeat, what I will change, and where I should focus my effort next year. A failed crop can still produce a successful lesson. Now this whole approach comes from an idea I have explored for many years, including in my book Experiments in Personal Change. The idea is that you treat life as a series of experiments. You make a plan, you take action, you observe what happens and then adjust. Now the garden has given me a very practical example of that process. I will leave details of the book below for anyone interested in exploring the wider idea. So this brings the main garden laboratory experiment to a close for this year. Thank you very much for watching. The experiment has done its job. I've got a lot of learning out of this year, and the garden isn't perfect. It was never about being perfect. It was about learning lessons and lessons that I can apply going forward into the future. So some areas of the garden are productive, others are overgrown. Some experiments worked extremely well and others failed. But the purpose is not about perfection. The purpose was about learning. So these videos have also acted as my laboratory notebook. So I'll be able to look back at them, and they allowed me to compare what I intended to do in the spring with what actually happened during the season. So without that record, it would be easy to remember only the successes or to look at the weeds today and decide that the whole experiment had failed, which it hasn't. I now know more clearly what we need from the garden and what fits my lifestyle, what demands too much attention, and what I want to do differently next year. So that's really important. Now this garden laboratory is part of my wider Life is a Laboratory approach, and I create books and courses around experimentation, about learning, about beekeeping and personal change, and I'll leave a few relevant links below for anyone who would like to explore these ideas further, and you're very welcome to explore further. But for now, this experiment has done its job. I did plan, I took action, I reflected, and this is what it's all about, the plan, act, reflect cycle. And I have learned as a result. And now I've learned what I can use to design the next experiment. And I hope to be back next year with a new revised plan and a new revised experiment for the garden laboratory. And I'll take the learning from this year, and next year will be better because it's going to build on the lessons I've learned this year. Thanks very much for following along. And as I said, I hope to maybe have an update in the autumn, and then again to continue the garden laboratory experiment next year. But thank you for following along, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've got some valuable lessons that you can apply in your own garden and in your wider life. Thank you very much.